This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
He's the most out there, hardcore Brexiteer, one of the English-speaking world's foremost political commentators. Whatever your views on Brexit, Brendan O'Neill's opinions on the nation-state when referred to Israel and Corbynistas and Jewish people are well worth a listen. Here is Brendan O'Neill.
Brendan, it's a great pleasure to say welcome to Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thank you, Jonny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, the order to my questions has been rather thrown up in the air by Julie Burchill. The delicious irony of her latest book, Welcome to the Woke Trials. It was set for release in the spring, being dumped by Little Brown Publishing, a very novel name for that company now, for crossing the line with Islamophobic comments that they refer to on Twitter. This is a spat with Ash Sarkar. The book was about the outrage mob chasing her. This is life imitating art in real time.
Absolutely. You couldn't make it up, as they used to say on the newspapers in the old days. A book about cancel culture being cancelled. And, what is really infuriating about this is that Little Brown, obviously, they hired Julie Burchill because she is Julie Burchill, and now they have fired Julie Burchill because she is Julie Burchill. That's essentially what's happened. Anyone who's familiar with the work of Julie Burchill, I'm a fan of hers, I must say. I've been reading her for years and years and years. They know she's very colourful, she's very outspoken, she's often very offensive. She doesn't give a damn if people are offended. That's always been her style right back to the 1980s. So, but I think what's changed, of course, is the broader culture. And the broader culture is now one that is alarmingly intolerant to anyone who has a different way of thinking or a colourful way of speaking, or who expresses themselves in less than politically correct terms. So Julie Burchill's speech crime was that she got involved in a Twitter spat with Ash Sarkar, the kind of Corbynista commentator, and made some comments about Islam and whom Muhammad was married to and so on and so forth. Now, we can disagree, perhaps, with Julie Burchill on whether it was wise to bring Islam into this particular discussion, but the broader point is this does look a lot like someone being punished for criticising Islam. And I know people are saying that her comments were racist, but essentially she's been dragged over the coals and had a book contract cancelled and being called every name under the sun because she blasphemed against Muhammad. That's what's going on here.
Now, there's a very interesting and another very important aspect to mention here about Julie, particularly in relation to this being a Jewish podcast. She's an arch-Zionist. She loves Jewish history. She recounts her philo-Semitism in this hilarious book called Unchosen. I mean, it is rip-roaringly amusing and funny. She grew up in Bristol outside a Jewish milieu completely, and this is where the woke left go from being annoyances to something rather more sinister, to Jewish ears, to immigrant ears, I think to Sikh ears, to Chinese ears. This is where the woke left becomes something slightly more dangerous.
Yeah, I think the woke left is very dangerous. I've always considered them dangerous. And if you look at the Corbynista Left in particular, the thing that strikes me about them, they seem to believe that they can glide through life spreading hatred, spreading division, which is what they do with the politics of identity, heaping contempt upon ordinary working class people who they refer to as gammon, which is another way of saying pig. They essentially called certain working class communities pigs. That's what's going on here. They demonize white people, especially white men, with a cause of every problem in the world. If I ever debate these people in public forums or in the media, they always say to me, "Oh, you're a white man." They reduce everyone to their racial characteristics. And they promote this kind of very divisive, racialized ideology, one in which certain groups are victims and therefore they're good, and other groups are the beneficiaries of history or the winners of history, or they're privileged and therefore they're bad. So a white cis man is like the most evil creature on earth, whereas, a transgender, queer, Muslim activist is like a god, essentially, in these people's eyes. So they categorize people by race. That's essentially what's going on here. And in relation to the issues that your podcast covers, the key thing, I think, one of the most damaging things about the politics of identity in its current form is that I think it is one of the engines behind the new anti-Semitism. Because this new anti-Semitism, which has been growing in recent years, I mean, it has echoes of the old anti-Semitism. You know, Jews controlling the world, controlling the media, being a pretty selfish, destructive people. You know, those old racist ideas are in there, but it has this new idea too, which is that the Jews are right up at the top of the list of the privileged. Therefore, they are bad. So people will often slip between talking about white privilege and Jewish privilege. They will say Jews can't possibly suffer prejudice or discrimination or racism because they're a privileged group. And they start to conceive of Jews as kind of being top of the ladder and therefore evil. And that, I think, is a really key component of why so many people in the Corbynista movement were anti-Semitic, because they adhered to this very destructive, hyper-racial politics of identity in which some groups are winners and other groups are losers.
And this is the sadness, because there are some good old-fashioned socialists who might be described as anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic that started their socialist careers as philo-Semites, because, of course, Jews, you used to be able to punch down as well. This idea that we can be punched up or punched down. Tony Benn is an example of that. He was someone who was very interested in dancing the horror when Israel was created. And by the end of his life, Israel got all too powerful, and he changed sides, didn't he?
Well, this is, I think, the shifting attitude to Israel is so interesting, because in the 60s and early 70s, you know, between 67 and 73, really, when Israel was fighting its various conflicts with belligerent neighboring countries, the left in the West, it wasn't uniformly pro-Israel, but there was lots of sympathy for Israel. There was sympathy for Israel as this plucky, new, new in the sense of being a modern defined nation state, a new country, a new state. It wasn't that long after the Holocaust. They were seen as a brave people who had survived the greatest crime in human history and were creating their own country, you know, a safe haven for Jewish people, and one that would be progressive and modern. And that was seen as a pretty good thing. It was seen as an expression of self-determination, national liberation, national self-determination. And the left in the West used to quite like those things. But over time, it shifted enormously. And now the left is rabidly anti-Israel in a way that always makes me suspicious. I'm one of those people who thinks you should be free to criticize any country on earth without being called racist. But there is something so iffy about the obsessive hatred with Israel. I think it was Howard Jacobson who said, listen, of course you can criticize Israel, but that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is never losing sleep over Israel. You're obsessing over it, and you're hating it with a passion that is far greater than the passion with which you hate any other nation. That's I always think, why do these people never talk about the Kurds, for example? You know, they obsess over the Palestinians. They talk about them endlessly. They don't talk about any other group, some of whom have far greater grievances than the Palestinians, in my view. The lesson that Western Europeans drew from the Second World War is that the nation state is a problem, gives rise to conflict, and we need the EU and all this happy-clappy post-border stuff. So the Western Europe draws the lesson that the nation state is a bad thing. The lesson that the Jews draw from the Second World War is that the nation state is absolutely essential for one's survival. And I think that's actually a very good description of the shift that has taken place and which has grown more and more over the decades. So you now have Western European intellectuals and activists and members of the cultural elite who are very self-consciously post-borders, anti-nation state, all that kind of crap, in my view. And then they look at Israel, which is a nation absolutely determined to protect its borders for very good reason. It's surrounded by hostile forces, very devoted to its national integrity, very devoted to self-protection, and they just see this nasty colonial-style apartheid project drenched in racism. I mean, that's how they view Israel, in these very irrational terms. So that shift, I think, tells us less about how Israel may have changed. I'm sure Israel has changed over the decades, but I think it tells us far more about how the left has changed and how they've abandoned their commitment to national self-determination and the right of the Jewish people to defend themselves. And they've shifted towards a position of myopic, irrational hatred of the state of Israel. Owen Jones and Ash Sarkar have both written pieces over the past few weeks, which I think are really questionable pieces, where they essentially say Labour has invented a hierarchy of racism. And that's really a way of them saying they give too much attention to anti-Semitism. What about Islamophobia? What about anti-black racism? And they reference this report that was done about Islamophobia in the Labour Party, which was basically a survey of a couple of hundred people who said they had overheard certain prejudiced views and so on. There's no comparison. Muslim MPs were not hounded out of the Labour Party by racist scumbags in the way that Jewish MPs were. Muslim representatives of Labour are not constantly insulted online and subjected to racist abuse in the way that Jewish members of the Labour Party are. There's no comparison. So what they're actually doing, they're actually diminishing the seriousness of left-wing anti-Semitism in the guise of being anti-racist. That's the really cynical game they're playing. So they pretend that they're being anti-racist by saying, what about anti-black racism? What about Islamophobia? But the design seems to be to diminish the seriousness of left-wing anti-Semitism, which, as we've seen over the past few years, has become incredibly toxic. Yeah. So there's this way in which the redefinition of anti-racism away from a very noble cause, a very unifying cause, which was about recognizing our human connections and forgetting about our racial differences. The shift away from that towards an anti-racism, which is about who's a privileged group and who's an oppressed group. Hindus are privileged, but Muslims are oppressed. Jews are privileged. And, this racial categorization of everyone, that is so destructive, so toxic, and it's actually rehabilitating racism in new ways. When the left talks about being anti-racist, I think actually what they mean is that they are politically correct racialists in the sense that they understand the world in racial terms. And that, I think, is incredibly dangerous.
The term Islamophobia, the very definition of the term is fought over. Whenever I hear the term Islamophobia, I freeze because there's no equivalence between the term anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It is often used as a defense for Islamism, I think, in short, isn't it? So Julie Burchill was sacked, removed, cancelled because basically she spoke out.
Yeah, I think I have huge issues with the term Islamophobia. I mean, I think, does anti-Muslim bigotry exist? Yes, of course. I'm sure there are people out there. I don't think it is a common position that people hold in the way that the media sometimes tells us it is. But I think there's anti-Muslim bigots. I think there are also anti-Sikh bigots. There are groups of bigots who hate certain people from certain religions and certain races for often irrational reasons. So, of course, that exists. But Islamophobia, that is something very, very different. Islamophobia is a term that was invented not that long ago, or certainly mainstreamed not that long ago in the UK. In the 1990s, it became mainstream in the UK, largely thanks to the Runnymede Trust, which issued a document about Islamophobia, and then it kind of leaks down into all the institutions and universities and all that kind of thing. And if you look at the Runnymede description of Islamophobia, it's very interesting because they explicitly have all these things like people who say that Islam is inferior to the West, for example. Now, my view is that that's a perfectly legitimate position to hold, right? If we are serious about exercising judgment and having open, honest discussions about the kind of value systems we want to live under, we have to be free to say, we think Western democracy, Western liberal democracy is superior to political Islam, for example, but that would be counted as an Islamophobic view. So Islamophobia seems pretty clear to me that it's used as a way of deflecting any criticism from Islam or from Islamic practices. Now, the problem with that, I mean, there's many problems. One is that it's deeply censorious and people are punished and shamed and hounded out of polite society simply for expressing a view on religion. So it kind of rehabilitates blasphemy law. It brings in blasphemy law by the back door. Only this time we're not protecting Christianity as the blasphemy laws in this country did before they were abolished, rightfully abolished in my view. But now it's protecting Islam. But then so that's terrible. The additional problem is I actually think this cult of Islamophobia pushed by all these well-connected institutions, I think it's bad for Muslims as well, because I think it demeans them. It turns them into these permanent victims who have to be looked after and saved. So when there is an Islamic terror attack, and the left in this country always hushes it up very quickly. You know, don't look back in anger. Don't talk about it too long. Move on with your life. Don't be Islamophobic by obsessing over the fact that 21 girls and young people were killed in Manchester. You know, what kind of person are you? They always take that kind of approach. I think that's bad for freedom, bad for open debate, and it's bad for Muslim communities because they are turned into children who have to be protected from legitimate, robust discussion. So it infantilizes Muslims. It censors people who just want to have an honest discussion about the difficulties and tensions in our society. So the idea of Islamophobia, I think, has had a very destructive impact on free debate. And people who compare Islamophobia to anti-Semitism, I'm afraid I just find those people incredibly suspect, because there is no comparison between a recently invented term that is used largely for censorious purposes and the oldest hatred in the world, which has led to literally the killings of millions upon millions of people. And anyone who makes that comparison, I think, is playing a dangerous game. When the left talks about being anti-racist, I think actually what they mean is that they are politically correct racialists, in the sense that they understand the world in racial terms. And that, I think, is incredibly dangerous.
This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
I ask you, what kind of peace partner is the Palestinian Authority while they continue to pay salaries to the families of those who've killed Israelis in suicide missions?
Another critical question that sadly is hardly ever discussed. What our plan also provides is that the Palestinian leadership must take steps to end that heinous practice of rewarding Palestinians who try to murder and harm Israelis. It was amazing to me that until the Taylor Force Act was passed, very, very few people paid attention to that.
A Chinese skeptic for quite a long time. I spent between 2010 and 2015 working in the Home Office, which is obviously the department responsible for national security, among other things. And I think if you have worked in national security and you have seen what the Chinese strategy is on different levels, then I think it's very difficult not to emerge from that with a fair degree of skepticism about China's role in the world, but also about Britain's policy towards China.
Jewish faith, it says, seek the fortune or seek the success of the city to which you have been exiled. You know, and I think that's the way you have to look at Jews. That's what they do. Jews try and make things better. They're in a country and they may not, you know, they go a slightly separate religion, but if you need them to help with anything, they're an amazing resource, you know.
I met him twice. You know, I was invited by my chief to report directly to the Prime Minister about what was going on in Sudan. So I had the opportunity of feeling how he thought about these people, and that he was really concerned. It was nothing political in it. It was really the guarantee that we should have one towards the other. We have to be responsible for each other. And that was his attitude. Everyone that participated in this operation, from the army and Mossad, that's how we felt, you know.
For those who listen, for those who are willing to listen, this is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Brexit. Love Europe, hate the EU. We first spoke in the month before the Brexit referendum when I hosted a talk radio show, and you came on against the Remainer Jonathan Friedland. When I was first presented with the vote, I pondered this love for Europe but objection to the EU. It became clearer, though, as I studied it, that this was a fight for British values. But it was actually what he called yeomanry, what I truly believed in. He called the mace and the traditions of opening parliament and these ideas of going here, here, like we're 19th century country squires, as opposed to clapping like they do in the 25-year-old Scottish Parliament, where they basically laugh at each other's jokes like it's a sort of Jimmy Tarbuck show. These are nice traditions, and we respect them and we look up to them. Friedland called it yeomanry. That means I must vote Brexit.
Yeah, it's the Brexit. I mean, Brexit is my favourite thing that's happened in my lifetime. I'm a hardcore Brexiteer, and I think it's the most sensible thing the British people have done since we got the franchise. In 1928 was the first year when all people, including women under the age of, including women over the age of 21, that's the first time we could all vote. And I think it's the best thing we've ever done with our vote, because we rejected the European Union, which I consider to be a deeply authoritarian, deeply undemocratic institution. There is plenty of evidence for that. The way it operates, the way the European Parliament is pretty much just a rubber stamp on the ideas that the European Commission comes up with, the way it has trashed and overridden votes taken by the Dutch people and the French people against the European Constitution, by the Irish people against the Nice Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, and against the Greek people who voted against EU austerity. The EU just ignores public sentiment and democratic sentiment all the time, and it tried to do the same with Brexit, and it still is, I think, trying to water down what the British people voted for, which was to take back control. And for me, it's not about defending British traditions. I mean, I'm sure some of our parliamentary traditions are a bit weird. I think they're fine. I don't think we need a radical overhaul of how Parliament cheers or operates or whatever else it does. But it was about defending people power. It was about defending the right of ordinary people to choose the people who make the laws that we live under. Now, that might sound very simple, but that's the idea that has pushed forward every democratic movement in history, right from the Levellers during the English Civil War in the 1640s, through to the Chartists in the 1840s who wanted the vote for working class men, and the suffragettes in the 1910s. One of the famous reasons that the suffragettes started to engage in civil disobedience is because they said, if we have no say over who makes the laws, then why shouldn't we break the laws? I mean, this has been the cohering idea of democratic movements, that if we're expected to live under a law, we need to have some democratic control over the people who make those laws. In the European Union, you don't have that, because the European Commission drafts laws or regulations or rules, and the European Parliament essentially just nods along and pushes it through. So voting against that, I think, was entirely in keeping with the best British tradition of the past 350 or 400 years, which is the tradition of standing up for the right of ordinary people to govern their own nation and to govern their own lives. And I think that's what Remainers miss. They sometimes think that we are just nostalgists for the past or nostalgists for empire. I mean, I must have spoken to thousands of Brexiteers over the past 4 years in various talks I've done and travelling around. I've never met a single person who has said, I can't wait for the British Empire to come back. Or I really am absolutely determined to defend the right of the Speaker in the House of Commons to use a certain phrase. I've never heard anyone say anything like that. All they say is, I want my vote to count. And when we have rules and regulations coming from the European Union, I feel that it doesn't count.
Yeah, here is what I'd say to that. But looking at it from a sort of Jewish perspective, I mean, these traditions do look archaic, but actually, as Hayek said, and we can argue about what kind of chap he was, Friedrich Hayek, but he did say things like that, that if the tradition that you look up to, that you have experienced, it makes you behave in a certain way. The mace looks like a religious artifact. Do you remember Ron Brown threw it on the floor in 1984? It's just a piece of metal. It might be solid gold, might have diamonds on it, but it is the sort of, it's like the lifeblood of the parliament. We don't have that anywhere else, and it's taken us 1,000 years to knock 3 times on the door and leave a wooden mark on it. And these things really mean something to immigrants, sons of immigrants, grandsons of immigrants like you and I, to coalesce around Britishness. And I get laughed at for saying things like that, and I have to say it in a podcast controlled environment for my own personal safety.
Well, yes, I'm sure you do. That's the sadness of our times. But I think I actually agree with you. And I think the thing, when I've visited Parliament or gone to Parliament to meet someone or do something, which is not very often, I must say, the thing that strikes me when I see these what might appear to be archaic systems or old-fashioned ways of doing things or very traditional forms of behavior, the thing it makes me think is how long it took for us to get this parliament, which is a democratic parliament where we select the people, the 650 people who sit in there, we select them and we can throw them out. I mean, it took centuries for that to happen, literally centuries for that to happen in a meaningful way. So when I see, the wooden door that's been knocked on so many times, or the various systems that have been put in place, I do think about the long struggle it took of huge numbers of generations to get us to this position. So I agree with that. I'm a bit of a radical Democrat, so I do want to overhaul some things that I think are problematic. Like, for example, I'm in favour of abolishing the House of Lords, or I certainly think we should have a referendum on abolishing the House of Lords. I don't think that's a tradition that I think is past its sell-by date. But there are other traditions in Parliament that I have a lot of admiration for. But the thing is, I think you're absolutely right about the question of immigrants and what message we send to immigrants these days. My parents are immigrants, so I'm a first generation Briton. I'm the first generation in my entire family history to be in this country, so I'm a complete newcomer. Of course, my parents came in a slightly odd historical period. Ireland gained its independence in the 1920s. My parents came here in 1970, just as the conflict between Britain and Ireland in Northern Ireland was hotting up once again. So there was it was a bit of a complicated journey for them. And they had some pretty instinctive, I wouldn't say anti-British, but they were uncomfortable with aspects of British history, which is understandable given that the town they both came from was burnt to the ground in the 1920s, which was something that their grandparents remembered and talked about. So there's all that going on. But lots of immigrants have that. Lots of immigrants have their families, their forefathers had a difficult relationship with Britain. But I think this is such an important question. How do we encourage immigrants to embrace this country, embrace its values, and embrace the project of being British and what that means? And I think too often now, the signal that our institutions and our politicians send to immigrants is, well, this country is a bit crap. You've got that Natural History Museum asking itself whether it is, is it a sinful place? Was Charles Darwin a bad person? You've got the British Library constantly banging on about its links with slavery. You've got politicians who express a very shamefaced approach to the British flag or any mention of British history. Very few politicians stood up for statues when they were being attacked over the summer during the Black Lives Matter uprising. All of this builds up and sends a message to new arrivals or the offspring of new arrivals, saying, essentially saying, why would you want to integrate into such an evil country? We've got to be so careful not to do that, because I think one byproduct of that is something like Islamic extremism, which is a problem in some Muslim communities. And I think that's part and parcel of sending a signal to people that this is a wicked country full of wicked people. I think that creates an enormous amount of hostility.
Around the time of the BLM changes, these sort of cultural ideas, multiculturalism to the fore, I basically reached out to as many immigrant communities as I could and thought to myself, is there anyone else who's from an immigrant community that was also proud to be British? So I got on the phone to Catherine Birbal Singh and Inaya Folarin Iman and, of course, Trevor Phillips. And to expand on your point there, Catherine Birbal Singh, with her amazing Michaela School in Wembley and various other places, she said, let's stop telling our Nigerian and Jamaican British kids to bring their flags in and bring in their foods. And, stop telling black kids that they're not from here, and that the idea that we can continue to coalesce around British values. And people scoff at British values. There's so many good ones. And, you talk about certain, I talked to many Sikh people around the Grenfell Tower disaster and about how they brought their traditions of food to those people who were struggling. It's a Sikh tradition, and they had a 1947 problem with Britain. That's not what we have in the Jewish thing. We're really quite grateful of saving us from Hitler, I must tell you. In fact, my uncle's middle name is Winston, and the company that my grandfather set up was called Britannia Typewriters. So that's the sort of tradition that I come from, and it is no coincidence that when there are protests against Jeremy Corbyn, you will see the Israeli flag, of course, a defiant symbol of national pride, but also very much next to it the British flag, and in opposition with EU flags, you'll see the Palestinian one. So we'll leave people to ponder that. COVID. This is what I think is a sort of a news gatherer, someone who has spent my career making news, and I think that's the most generous term I can say, perhaps manipulating news, localizing news to communities. There's real COVID, and then there's media and government COVID. And I decided a while ago that the real threat to us comes from the latter in terms of the curtailments of our personal freedoms. They better push back on this tier 3, tier 2, tier 1 nonsense as soon as this plague is over, because I fear, Brendan, that some of this will continue to impinge on our lives.
I completely agree. That's one of the things that worries me most about the current period and the COVID crisis. History shows us that when governments accrue a lot of power, they're often very reluctant to relinquish it after the crisis, after the emergency. And that's something we've got to be incredibly conscious of and wary about going into 2021. I think, I'm not a COVID conspiracy theorist. Like you, I know COVID is real. I think it's quite serious. I had COVID in late March, early April, and for me it was kind of mostly just unpleasant for a few days, and lost my sense of taste and smell, and had these completely bizarre headaches, and was very, very tired for about 4 or 5 days. But it was quite manageable. I've been sicker before with other kind of bugs and flu, so for me it was manageable. I think for most people, it is manageable. Obviously, it gets more and more dangerous the older you get. So I think there should have been greater protection of older people, especially in care homes. And the government failed on that front to a shocking degree. I think that the problem was when we had the first lockdown is that the government locked down healthy young people and stopped them from going to work and being productive. And it failed to lock down vulnerable older people in care homes, which were old people were being sent back from hospitals into care homes where the disease was spreading and so on. So the lockdown myopia, I think, has a lot to answer for, because we became so obsessed with locking down the general population and policing their behavior, making sure they weren't going for 2 jogs a day or going to the park and all that stuff, that we forgot to protect the people who we knew pretty early on were the most vulnerable. That was a failure. And I think that failure is largely down to the way in which we grasped onto the Chinese idea of locking down very early on, and we haven't let go all year. And so I think there's COVID, there's the real thing, there's the virus, which is quite contagious and which is dangerous for older populations. So there's COVID, but then, as you say, there's something else. And the something else, I think, is is the political, cultural climate in which COVID has come to this country. Politics of fear, a politics of authoritarianism, a kind of apocalypticism, this idea that the world's coming to an end. We see that idea in relation to the politics of climate change and lots of other issues as well. So when COVID came, all those pre-existing political trends, many of which I think are quite irrational, all those pre-existing political trends just completely exploded and gave rise to the most authoritarian experiment in living memory. And my concern is twofold. Firstly, that authoritarian experiment will go on, and we have to be very clear to politicians that we do not want it to go on any longer than necessary. And the second thing is, it's had such a destructive impact on people's lives and livelihoods. Untreated cancer, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lost jobs, despair, poverty, unemployment, mental ill health, all those things are going to be consequences of what the government did and what its cheerleaders demanded. And I think someone at some point will have to answer for that too.
I also asked Brendan who his nomination for Person of the Year was.
My choice is Samuel Paty. I think he is the hero of the year. And I think one of the most disgraceful things of this year has been the way in which people in the UK just kind of ignored that horrific atrocity. A man beheaded in broad daylight for the crime of teaching children about freedom of speech. That should have got a lot more coverage in the UK. Our politicians should have stood shoulder to shoulder with France in relation to that. I think it's embarrassing that we didn't do that. But, Paty is the kind of person who I'm sure he gives French people hope. I think he should give all of us hope, which is people are brave enough to stand up for freedom of speech in a time when that can be quite a difficult thing to do. So he's my hero of 2020. I think there have been lots of heroes this year, but I think he's got to be number one.
I asked Brendan how on earth football could institute the Black Lives Matter salute week after week, month after month.
Booing Black Lives Matter is not the same as booing black people. And we know this for a fact because football fans up and down the country every weekend cheer on black players. Kids worship black players. Millwall fans and Aston Villa fans and every other fan cheers black players every single weekend. Yeah. That's what they do. They love them and they appreciate them. And Millwall has had black players as its player of the year. And
they have black supporters as well, Brendan.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how football works. And Black Lives Matter with small letters. I have never in my life met someone who disagrees with that statement and who doesn't understand that Black Lives Matter as much as any other life. But Black Lives Matter with capital letters is something very different, as you say. It has eccentric views which are not popular with ordinary people.
Am I being thick here by suggesting that living Marxism has a lot of parallels with Thatcherism?
Well, no.
It sounds similar. I'll tell you why I say that. One of the greatest acts of social justice that I've seen since the war, as I worked the Birmingham and Black Country area as a teenager, was the empowerment of the working family to buy their own council house. Roads tidied up, walls were clad, perhaps that wasn't such a good move in the future. People were taking foreign holidays on the knock, on the credit. There were 2 cars in the driveway. People were getting on and in buying their council house for 60% of its value, creating a wealth for the next generation to perhaps move on as well. The empowerment of the individual economically, to me, as someone who is outside of Marxism and perhaps was a casual Tory voter, not a member of the Tory party, Thatcher's very ideological right-wing ideas seem to converge with a lot of what you said just then.
Well, living Marxism was stingingly critical of Thatcher for various reasons in relation to events that happened before I achieved political consciousness, like the miners' strike and things like that.
Right.
So they would have been on different sides then. But I think what's important about that period, not just the 70s and 80s, but before that too, the real conflict between the left and the left and the right had a shared vision in a sense, in the sense that both were or both claimed to be devoted to the expansion of freedom, and to upholding people's democratic rights. I mean, that's the right and the left both said that. They disagreed over how that might be achieved. They disagreed over how progress would be achieved. So the left would say, no, we have to seize the means of production and then we can have genuine industrial utopia. Whereas the right would have said, no, the market is the best way to ensure that everyone is wealthy and so on. So that was the disagreement. But they agreed on expanding human wealth, expanding human freedom. But the difference was over how that can be done. Now, the difference now is that the left, most of all the left, has given up on those ideas entirely. So it's no longer interested in expanding human freedom. It's only interested in cancelling wrongthink and censoring people and so on, and being super pro-lockdown. It's no longer interested in human progress and industrialization, and increasingly sees those things as bad and evil and destructive. So there's been a really important, massive shift in how the left thinks of what the goal of a good society should be. But I really agree with you on the council house thing, because I grew up in a council house, which my parents bought thanks to Thatcher. And I cannot explain to you, when I meet members of the middle class left, there is no policy that infuriates them more than the right to buy policy. They absolutely loathe it. They think it was the most destructive thing that's ever happened. And this really infuriates me, because these are very often people who grew up in nice houses that their parents owned, who think that working class families like mine, which bought their houses, their council houses, they think essentially that we stole from society. That's really how they see it. And that, I think, expresses some of the class snobbery on the left, because it's fine for them to be property holding people, but not for riffraff like the rest of us. So that's one thing I'll always be grateful to Thatcher for. She allowed families like mine to own a real form of wealth that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to do.
I get scoffed at for that, and I really mean it. And you could tell on any road in Warsaw the house that had been bought under the preemption clause and the one that hadn't, because the windows were a bit smashed and they hadn't looked after it, and they were probably in arrears with their rent with the council, and they hadn't bothered or hadn't got their act together to buy their house at 50, 40, maybe 30% of the value of it for 60 grand, which, was just about affordable on the wages in those days of 17, 18 grand a year. It was, I'm really grateful. And of course, my favourite moment at PMQs was when Michael Howard reached over at Tony Blair for all of us, because I'm a grammar school boy as well. And this grammar school boy won't take any truck from that public school boy over there. I think it's my favourite moment ever, and I don't think it'll ever be topped. Brendan, you've given so much time, and I'm so grateful today. And just one final question about optimism. You must be optimistic about Britain post Brexit.
Oh, I'm a natural optimist. I know I moan and criticize things all the time, but I am a natural optimist. I'm optimistic about a lot of things, even though 2020 has been the maddest year I think any of us can remember. The whole Western world locked down, the economy thrown into the toilet, very destructive policies were enacted, in my view. There was an absolute explosion of wokeness and censorship and intolerance from the summer onwards. And I think some of our institutions went completely and utterly mental in terms of hiding statues or hiding exhibits or all that stuff. So a lot of absolutely insane stuff happened this year. But I think there is such a well of common sense in this country. There's such a well, and you will know this as an accomplished broadcaster who speaks to people a lot. There is such a well of decency and common sense, and people wanting to be in control of the country and to push it in a positive direction. And that's still there, even though members of the political elites tried for a long time to suppress the vote for Brexit or to tell people they're racist and stupid and everything else. That thirst among ordinary people for a more reasonable democratic form of politics, which is concerned about people's economic and futures rather than being concerned about stupid issues like statues and so on. That well of common sense is always going to stand this country in good stead, in my view. And if a political party comes along which is genuinely willing to engage, to jump into that well of common sense and really to engage with it, that could have a massively transformative impact on politics. So post-Brexit, I hope there will emerge new political forces which will say, we've talked to the chattering classes more than enough. We've listened to the media elites for too long. Now let's go out into the country and talk to the millions and millions of people and engage with the wisdom of the crowd. And if we do that, I think post-Brexit will be absolutely fine.
Amen. Brendan O'Neill, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for all the time that you've given.
For those who listen, for those who are willing to listen, this is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.